They say time heals all wounds. 7 years behind bars taught me that's a lie. Time doesn't heal, it sharpens. It hones your rage into something precise, something deadly. My name is Daniel Cole, and this is the story of how prison didn't break me. It forged me into the perfect weapon for revenge. The day Marcus Holbrook testified against me, swearing under oath that he'd seen me loading stolen electronics into my truck, I watched my life crumble from the defendant's chair. My best friend since college, my business partner, the man who'd been best man at my almost wedding, he looked me straight in the eye and lied with the conviction of a saint. The jury believed him. Why wouldn't they? Marcus was clean-cut, successful, seemingly heartbroken that his dear friend had betrayed their trust. I was the one with grease under my fingernails, the one who handled the dirty work, while he schmoozing clients in his pressed suits. 7 years for grand theft and conspiracy. 7 years ripped from my life while Marcus walked free, inheriting our company, our dreams, and eventually Sarah, the woman I'd planned to marry before my world collapsed. The first year nearly killed me. Riverside Penitentiary wasn't a place for rehabilitation. It was a concrete jungle where the weak became prey. I learned that lesson my first week when 3 inmates cornered me in the showers, assuming the new fish would be easy meat. They left me bleeding on the tile floor, but something inside me hardened that night. Not just my resolve, my entire being crystallized into something colder, more patient. I stopped being the Daniel who trusted easily, who laughed loudly, who believed in justice. That Daniel was weak. This Daniel would survive. I began to study, not just books, though I devoured everything in the prison library from business law to psychology. I studied people, learning to read their tells, their weaknesses, their pressure points. I studied patience, spending hours in my cell planning, thinking, calculating. Most importantly, I studied myself, rebuilding my body and mind into something harder than the concrete walls that contained me. The older inmates taught me things they don't put in textbooks. Tommy, the accountant, Marcelli, doing life for embezzlement, showed me how money really moved in the modern world. The digital trails, the shell companies, the offshore accounts that prosecutors never found. Vincent Torino, former hitman turned philosophical lifer, taught me about the long game, about how the sweetest revenge comes not from a moment of violence but from watching your enemy destroy himself while you pull the strings from the shadows. By my 3rd year, I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. Other inmates came to me for advice, for planning, for solutions to their problems. I became someone people feared and respected, but never someone who lost control. Control was everything now. Control was power. When I walked through those prison gates 7 years later, I was 35 years old and nobody I used to know would have recognized me. Gone was the trusting fool who'd built a business on handshake deals. In his place stood a man who'd learned to see 10 moves ahead, who understood that true power came not from force but from information, patience, and timing. My first stop wasn't Marcus's office or the house that used to be mine. It was a coffee shop across from their corporate headquarters, Cole and Holbrook Industrial Solutions, though my name had long since been scrubbed from the letterhead. Through the window, I watched Marcus arrive in a Mercedes I'd never seen before, watched him stride through the lobby like he owned the world, which I supposed he thought he did. Sarah walked beside him, her hand on his arm, wearing a diamond ring that caught the morning light. For a moment, just a moment, I felt the old pain flare in my chest. Then it faded, replaced by something colder, more useful. I spent 3 weeks just watching, learning their routines, mapping their lives. Marcus left for work at 7:30 sharp, drove the same route, had lunch at the same restaurant every Tuesday with city council members and potential investors. Sarah worked part-time at an art gallery, spent her afternoons at yoga, met girlfriends for wine on Thursdays. They'd grown comfortable in their success, predictable in their happiness. That predictability would be their downfall. The first thread I pulled was small, a discrepancy in their EPA filings I'd spotted after hacking into their supposedly secure servers. Prison had connected me with people who knew things about computers that would make Silicon Valley executives weep. A few carefully placed anonymous tips to the right regulatory officials, and suddenly Cole and Holbrook was facing unexpected inspections and hefty fines. Marcus weathered that storm as I knew he would. But it rattled him, made him paranoid, caused him to make mistakes. He started cutting corners to recoup the fine money, which gave me more ammunition, more threads to pull. The second blow came through their biggest client, a city contract for waste management systems worth $12 million. It had taken me 2 months to discover that Marcus had won the bid through some creative accounting and a few envelope-stuffed handshakes with city officials. A copy of those documents, along with recorded phone conversations I'd obtained through very unofficial channels, found their way to the local newspaper's investigative reporter. The scandal broke on a Tuesday. By Friday, the contract was canceled and 3 city officials had resigned. Marcus's name was plastered across every front page in the state as the investigation widened. I watched him on the evening news, standing outside his lawyer's office, his face pale and drawn as reporters shouted questions. "Mr. Holbrook, did you bribe city officials? Is it true your company has been under investigation for environmental violations? What do you say to accusations that you built your business on corruption?" Sarah stood behind him, no longer the confident woman I'd observed for months. She looked fragile, confused, like she was seeing her husband clearly for the first time. That was phase 2 beginning, the personal destruction. You see, while I'd been systematically dismantling Marcus's business empire, I'd also been cultivating relationships with their mutual friends, their neighbors, people in their social circle. Daniel Cole was supposed to be a broken ex-convict somewhere, but David Coleman, the identity I'd carefully constructed with help from my prison connections, was a successful consultant who'd moved to town for work. David was charming, well-read, the kind of man who remembered birthdays and asked about people's children. David gradually became trusted, even beloved, in their social circle. It was David who mentioned to Sarah's best friend Jennifer that he'd heard troubling rumors about Marcus's fidelity. David who happened to have photos of Marcus's lunch meetings with his attractive young secretary, meetings that went well beyond discussing quarterly reports. David who knew which threads to pull to make Sarah question everything she thought she knew about her marriage. The divorce proceedings began just as the FBI finished their investigation into the bribery scandal. Marcus was looking at federal charges, the loss of his business, and now the collapse of his personal life. But I wasn't finished. Not even close. The house, my house, the one I designed and saved for and planned to fill with children, became part of the divorce settlement. Sarah, guided by the excellent legal advice she'd received from lawyers I'd carefully recommended, claimed half of everything. Marcus, desperate to maintain some liquidity for his mounting legal fees, had to sell. I bought it through a shell company for 30 cents on the dollar. By the time Marcus realized who owned his former home, he was living in a studio apartment above a diner, working nights at a warehouse loading dock to pay his legal bills. His lawyers had abandoned him when the retainer money ran out. His friends had distanced themselves as the corruption charges multiplied. Even Sarah had taken back her maiden name and moved across the country to start over. It took me 6 months to track down his new address, not because he was hiding particularly well, but because I wanted to savor the anticipation. When I finally knocked on his door on a cold Thursday evening in March, the man who answered looked like a ghost of the Marcus Holbrook who testified against me 8 years earlier. He was thinner, grayer, worn down by the weight of watching everything he'd stolen from me crumble in his hands. But it was his eyes that satisfied me most. They held the same haunted look I'd carried for the first 2 years of my sentence. The look of a man who discovered that justice was just a word people used to make themselves feel better. "Hello, Marcus." Recognition dawned slowly, followed by fear, then a desperate kind of resignation. He stepped back, his hand still on the doorknob as if he could somehow close out what was coming. "Daniel, I heard you were released. Did you? That's interesting. I wasn't aware you were keeping track." I stepped past him into his cramped apartment, noting the bare walls, the fold-out furniture, the smell of desperation that clung to everything. "Nice place. Very minimalist." He closed the door and turned to face me, his shoulders squared in what I recognized as false bravado. The same stance he'd probably practiced in the mirror before testifying against me. "What do you want?" I smiled and I saw him flinch at the expression. Prison had taught me many things, but perhaps most valuable was how to smile in a way that promised suffering. "What?" "Marcus, I don't want anything from you. I already have everything that matters." I moved to his single window, looking out at the parking lot where his rusted Honda sat among the other vehicles of the economically desperate. "Your business, your reputation, your friends, your wife, your house, I've taken it all. Just like you took mine. I never meant. You never meant to get caught." I turned back to him, my voice calm, conversational. "That's what you were going to say, wasn't it? You never meant for it to go so far, never meant for me to spend 7 years in a cage while you lived my life." The silence stretched between us, broken only by the sound of traffic outside and the steady drip of a leaky faucet in his kitchenette. "The irony," I continued, "is that you probably convinced yourself you were the victim somehow. Poor Marcus, forced to betray his best friend to save his own skin. Poor Marcus, who just got in a little too deep with the wrong people and saw an opportunity to pin it all on his trusting partner." His face had gone pale, confirming what I'd suspected all along. Marcus hadn't just betrayed me, he'd been the one stealing from our company, probably for months before I was arrested. I was just convenient, the perfect scapegoat with access and no alibi. You want to know the beautiful thing about prison, Marcus? It teaches you patience. It teaches you that the best revenge isn't quick, it's thorough. It's complete. I paused, choosing my words carefully, educational. I moved closer, close enough to see the sweat beading on his forehead despite the apartment's chill. 7 years ago, you taught me that trust was weakness, that friendship meant nothing, that good men finish last. You taught me that the world belongs to people who are willing to destroy others for their own gain. My voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Thank you for that lesson, Marcus. It served me very well. What happens now? His voice cracked on the question. I considered him for a long moment, this broken man who'd once been my closest friend, who'd stood with me at my father's funeral and celebrated with me when we landed our first major contract. The old Daniel might have felt something, pity, perhaps, or even forgiveness. But the old Daniel was dead, murdered in a prison cell and replaced with something infinitely more dangerous. Now you live with what you've done. You wake up every morning knowing that everything you lost because you chose to betray the one person who trusted you completely. You live knowing that I could have destroyed you physically, and believe me, I learned how, but instead I chose to destroy you the way you destroyed me. Piece by piece, dream by dream, hope by hope. I moved toward the door, then paused with my hand on the knob. Oh, and Marcus, if you're thinking about running, about starting over somewhere else, about rebuilding, don't. I'll be watching. I'll always be watching. Because prison didn't just teach me patience, it taught me that some debts can never be fully paid. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, leaving him standing in his empty apartment with nothing but the weight of his choices and the certain knowledge that his punishment was far from over. As I walked to my car, a black sedan that had once belonged to his company's fleet, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 8 years. Not satisfaction exactly. Not even happiness. It was something colder, more complete. Justice. Real justice. The kind that doesn't come from courtrooms or judges or juries, but from the patient, methodical application of consequences. The kind that teaches men like Marcus Holbrook that every choice has a price, and that price must eventually be paid. Prison hadn't broken Daniel Cole. It had killed him, burned away everything weak and naive and trusting, leaving behind something harder and infinitely more dangerous. Something that understood that in a world where good men are devoured by wolves, sometimes you have to become the better predator. As I drove away from Marcus's pathetic apartment, I allowed myself one last look in the rearview mirror. He was standing at his window watching me leave, and in his face I saw the same expression I'd worn for the first 2 years of my sentence. The look of a man who'd finally learned that the world was not the place he thought it was. The difference was I'd learned to thrive in that world. And Marcus Holbrook was only just beginning to understand how much he had left to lose.